The year is 1925, and a small town in Tennessee is about to become the center of the world's attention. But this isn't the story you think you know about the Scopes monkey trial. Hidden beneath the circus of reporters, lawyers, and religious fervor lies a darker truth about how an entire region of America was sold a version of itself that never really existed. What if I told you that the Bible Belt, that sacred stretch of American soil supposedly steeped in centuries of unwavering Christian devotion, was actually manufactured? Not by God, not by generations of faithful settlers, but by a calculated campaign of politicians, preachers, and propagandists who needed a narrative powerful enough to rebuild a shattered South. The man standing in that Dayton, Tennessee courtroom wasn't just defending the right to teach evolution. He was unknowingly witnessing the final act of one of America's most successful reinvention stories. Because the South that emerged from the ashes of the Civil War bore little resemblance to the South that would later claim divine mandate. And the religion that would define the region for the next century? It was about to be weaponized in ways its founders never imagined. Pull up any map of American religion today, and you'll see it. That dark red swath cutting across the southeastern United States, labeled with terms like evangelical stronghold and Bible Belt. Drive through Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and you'll count church steeples like fence posts. But here's what they don't teach in Sunday school. This wasn't always the case. Before the Civil War, the South was actually less religious than the North. Church attendance was sporadic, ministers were scarce, and the planter elite often viewed evangelical Christianity with the same suspicion they reserved for abolitionists. The real Bible Belt of antebellum America stretched across upstate New York, where revival fires burned so frequently they called it the burned-over district. So what happened? How did a region that once exported tobacco, cotton, and skepticism toward organized religion become the unshakable foundation of American evangelicalism? The answer begins in the smoldering ruins of Atlanta and the bitter taste of defeat that lingered long after Appomattox. When Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered in 1865, he wasn't just ending a war. He was leaving behind a power vacuum that ambitious men would spend the next 6 decades filling with carefully crafted mythology. The South had lost everything: its economy, its political power, its young men, and perhaps most devastatingly, its identity. The plantation system that had defined Southern culture for generations lay in ruins. The racial hierarchy that had justified slavery was under assault. Even the romantic notion of Southern honor had been trampled under Sherman's boots. Into this psychological wasteland stepped a collection of the most unlikely alliance in American history: defeated Confederate officers, ambitious ministers, and opportunistic politicians who recognized that the South needed a new story about itself. Not just any story, but one powerful enough to restore pride, justify the past, and provide a roadmap for the future. They found their answer in the Old Testament. The story they began to tell went something like this. The South had always been God's chosen land, populated by his chosen people. The Civil War wasn't a defeat, it was a test, like Job's trials or the Israelites' exile in Babylon. The North hadn't won through superior moral cause. They had won through industrial might and foreign immigration that diluted true American Christianity. The South, meanwhile, remained pure, faithful, and ultimately blessed by divine providence. This wasn't just Sunday school storytelling. This was the systematic construction of a regional identity that would shape American politics for the next century and a half. Hey there, I'm Professor Archive, and you've just stumbled into one of the most fascinating cover-ups in American history. Before we dig deeper into how the Bible Belt was manufactured, I'm curious. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Are you a fellow history buff staying up late? Or maybe someone discovering that everything you thought you knew about American religious history needs a serious fact check? Drop a comment and let me know what brought you here tonight. The architect of this transformation had a name you've probably never heard: Robert Louis Dabney. A Presbyterian minister and former Confederate chaplain, Dabney understood something that escaped many of his contemporaries. Theology could be politics by other means. In the 1870s and 1880s, Dabney and ministers like him began preaching a version of Christianity that was perfectly tailored to Southern grievances. They developed what scholars now call lost cause theology, a religious framework that portrayed the Confederacy as a Christian nation destroyed by godless Yankees. But Dabney went further. He argued that the South's defeat was actually proof of its righteousness. Just as Christ had suffered and died, the South had been crucified for its faith. Reconstruction wasn't political occupation, it was religious persecution. And just as Christ would rise again, so too would the South, stronger and more faithful than before. This wasn't theology, it was therapy, and it worked. Churches that had struggled to fill pews before the war suddenly found themselves packed with converts, seeking both salvation and vindication. Ministers who had once competed with gambling, drinking, and dueling for the attention of Southern men now found eager audiences hungry for a message that made their suffering meaningful. But the real genius of the lost cause theology wasn't what it said about the past. It was how it mapped onto the future. By casting the South as God's chosen people, these ministers weren't just offering comfort, they were promising restoration. Not just spiritual restoration, but political and cultural restoration as well. The consequences were immediate and dramatic. Between 1870 and 1900, church membership in the South exploded. Baptist and Methodist congregations that had been small, scattered affairs became the organizing centers of entire communities. More importantly, they became the training grounds for a new generation of Southern leaders who saw no distinction between Christian duty and political action. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because the Christianity that emerged from this theological revolution wasn't the turn-the-other-cheek variety that Northern abolitionists had preached. This was Old Testament Christianity, complete with chosen peoples, promised lands, and divine mandates to drive out the unrighteous. When Reconstruction ended in 1877 and federal troops withdrew from the South, these newly energized Christian communities didn't turn their attention to charity and contemplation. They turned it to politics. Specifically to the systematic disenfranchisement of black voters and the establishment of Jim Crow. The same ministers who preached about Southern righteousness on Sunday spent their weekdays organizing voter intimidation campaigns, supporting poll taxes, and justifying lynching as divine punishment for racial transgression. The same churches that claimed to follow the Prince of Peace became the institutional backbone of a system of racial apartheid that would endure for nearly a century. This wasn't a corruption of the lost cause theology. This was its logical conclusion. If the South was God's chosen land and white Southerners were his chosen people, then any challenge to white supremacy was by definition a challenge to God himself. By 1900, the transformation was complete. A region that had entered the Civil War with a relatively weak religious identity had emerged with the strongest, most politically engaged Christian culture in America. The Bible Belt wasn't just a religious phenomenon. It was a political machine wrapped in theological clothing. But how did this manufactured identity become so deeply embedded that it survives to this day? How did a story created by defeated Confederate officers become accepted as timeless truth? The answer lies in what happened next: the systematic erasure of the South's actual religious history. In the early decades of the 20th century, Southern historians, ministers, and educators embarked on what can only be described as a memory project. They began teaching a version of Southern history that pushed the origins of the region's Christian identity back centuries, long before the Civil War, long before slavery, back to the very founding of the colonies. Sunday school curricula were rewritten to emphasize the religiosity of early Southern settlers. History textbooks began describing colonial Virginia and the Carolinas as bastions of Christian faith. Family genealogies were scrubbed clean of inconvenient details about irreligious ancestors or non-English immigrants. Most importantly, the timeline was deliberately confused. Children growing up in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s were taught that their region had always been deeply Christian, that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had fought the Civil War as holy warriors defending Christian civilization against godless aggression. It was a lie, but it was a lie told so consistently, so passionately, and by so many trusted authorities that it became indistinguishable from truth. The Scopes trial in 1925 was actually the coming out party for this new Southern Christian identity. When William Jennings Bryan arrived in Dayton to defend biblical literalism against the forces of modern science, he wasn't just representing fundamentalist Christianity. He was representing the culmination of 60 years of theological engineering. The reporters who flocked to Tennessee expecting to find an isolated pocket of backwoods ignorance instead discovered something far more sophisticated, a fully developed alternative worldview that had been carefully constructed to resist exactly the kind of modernizing pressures that Bryan opposed. But here's the twist that even Bryan didn't fully understand. The very fundamentalism he was defending was itself a modern invention. The biblical literalism that he claimed represented timeless Christian truth had actually been developed in the late 19th century, largely by Southern ministers seeking to distinguish their theology from the social gospel preaching of Northern churches. The strict separation between science and faith that fundamentalists demanded, that was new too. Before the Civil War, Southern ministers had actually been quite comfortable with scientific discovery, seeing it as a way to better understand God's creation. It was only after defeat and Reconstruction that science became the enemy, not because it contradicted Scripture, but because it was associated with Northern intellectual dominance. So when Clarence Darrow cross-examined Bryan on that sweltering July day in 1925, he wasn't just challenging religious belief, he was inadvertently testing whether a completely manufactured religious identity could withstand rational scrutiny. The answer, as it turned out, was yes. But not because the identity was true, because it was necessary. By the 1920s, 3 generations of white Southerners had grown up believing that their Christianity wasn't just a personal faith, it was the foundation of their racial, cultural, and political identity. To question biblical literalism wasn't just to question Scripture, it was to question whether the South had any legitimate claim to moral authority at all. This is why the Scopes trial became such a symbol. It wasn't really about evolution or education. It was about whether the South's carefully constructed identity could survive contact with the modern world. And for the next 40 years, it seemed like the answer was yes. The Bible Belt that emerged from the 1920s was a political and cultural force unlike anything America had ever seen. It provided the organizational backbone for massive resistance to civil rights, the intellectual framework for Cold War anti-communism, and eventually the foot soldiers for the conservative revolution that would reshape American politics in the 1980s and beyond. But success bred its own problems. By the 1960s, the manufactured Christianity of the Bible Belt was running up against some inconvenient truths. The first was generational. Young white Southerners in the 1960s were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about how their grandparents' Christian civilization had produced Jim Crow. They read the same New Testament that their parents read, but somehow came away with very different ideas about racial justice. The second was theological. Northern evangelicals, particularly after World War II, had begun developing more sophisticated approaches to biblical interpretation that didn't require complete rejection of modern science or historical criticism. Southern fundamentalists found themselves increasingly isolated, defending positions that even many conservative Christians elsewhere had abandoned. The third was practical. The economic modernization of the South was bringing in Northern businesses, Northern workers, and Northern ideas that didn't fit neatly into the Lost Cause framework. Atlanta wanted to be an international city. Birmingham wanted to attract industrial investment. Even Jackson and Montgomery were discovering that racial segregation was bad for business. Something had to give. What gave, it turned out, was not the manufactured identity itself, but its most extreme expressions. Beginning in the 1970s, a new generation of Southern Christian leaders began what could be called the Great Sanitization, a systematic effort to preserve the political power of Bible Belt Christianity while discarding its most obviously indefensible elements. Out went the explicit racism, the lost cause mythology, and the most rigid forms of biblical literalism. In came colorblind conservatism, constitutional originalism, and intelligent design. The underlying structure remained the same. White Southern Christians were still God's chosen people with a divine mandate to lead the nation. But the packaging became more sophisticated, more palatable to national audiences. This wasn't compromise, this was evolution. The same political and theological instincts that had created the Bible Belt in the first place were now adapting it for a new century. The result was the religious right, a political movement that took the organizational advantages of Bible Belt Christianity and married them to conservative causes that could appeal to non-Southern audiences. Abortion, gay rights, school prayer, and family values became the new battlegrounds, replacing the racial issues that had defined Southern Christianity for a century. But here's the crucial point. This wasn't a new movement. It was the old movement with better marketing. The leaders of the religious right weren't pioneering a new form of political Christianity. They were taking a form of political Christianity that had been perfected in the South over the course of a century and exporting it to the rest of the country. Jerry Falwell wasn't inventing Christian conservatism when he founded the Moral Majority in 1979. He was packaging and nationalizing a form of conservative Christianity that his grandfather's generation had created in response to Reconstruction. Pat Robertson wasn't discovering the political potential of religious broadcasting when he launched the 700 Club. He was scaling up techniques that Southern ministers had been using to build political coalitions since the 1890s. The so-called values voters who became such a dominant force in Republican politics weren't a new constituency. They were the direct descendants of the white Southern Christians who had been voting their religious convictions since the end of Reconstruction. This is why, if you want to understand American politics today, you need to understand the Bible Belt. Not the mythological Bible Belt of Sunday school curricula and Heritage Foundation white papers, but the actual Bible Belt. The one that was consciously constructed by defeated Confederates as a tool for political and cultural restoration. Because that Bible Belt didn't disappear when the religious right went national, it became the template for conservative Christianity throughout the country. Today, evangelical churches in Ohio and Iowa and Colorado organize their political activities using methods pioneered in Alabama and Mississippi. Conservative Christian voters in Michigan and Pennsylvania embrace political priorities first articulated by South Carolina ministers in the 1880s. Biblical literalism that was invented in post-Civil War Virginia is now defended as timeless truth by Christians across the country who have no idea where those ideas actually came from. The Bible Belt won, not by convincing America to become Southern, but by convincing America to become evangelical in the distinctly Southern way. But winning came with a price. The gradual exposure of the contradictions that had been built into the system from the beginning. Because when you build a religious identity on political foundations, every political defeat becomes a theological crisis. When you claim divine mandate for your cultural preferences, every cultural change becomes an apocalyptic threat. When you insist that your version of Christianity is the only authentic version, every criticism becomes persecution. This is why American evangelicalism today seems to be in constant crisis mode. It's not because the culture is becoming more hostile to Christianity. Polls consistently show that Americans remain remarkably religious compared to citizens of other developed countries. It's because the particular form of Christianity that emerged from the post-Civil War South was designed for combat, not contemplation. The lost cause theology that created the Bible Belt promised its followers that their suffering would be vindicated, their enemies would be vanquished, and their righteousness would be recognized. When those promises failed to materialize, when civil rights succeeded, when secular culture thrived, when other forms of Christianity gained influence, the theology had no resources for adaptation. Instead, it doubled down. If God's promises weren't being fulfilled, it must be because the faithful weren't fighting hard enough, believing fervently enough, or voting consistently enough. This is the trap that the manufactured Bible Belt has created for itself. The very success of its political project has made it impossible to acknowledge the human, historical origins of its own identity. To admit that the Bible Belt was consciously constructed would be to admit that it could be consciously deconstructed. To acknowledge that Southern Christian identity was shaped by political needs would be to suggest that it could be reshaped by different political needs. So instead, the myths persist. The lost cause theology continues to shape evangelical political priorities, even though most evangelicals have no idea what the lost cause was. The assumption that conservative politics and authentic Christianity are synonymous continues to drive voting patterns, even though that assumption was created by specific historical circumstances that no longer exist. The organizational methods pioneered by post-Reconstruction Southern ministers continue to define evangelical political engagement, even though those methods were designed to support racial segregation. And perhaps most importantly, the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation and has fallen away from its religious roots continues to motivate conservative activism, even though that idea was invented by people who had just finished fighting a war against the actual founding principles of the American Republic. If this analysis sounds harsh, consider the alternative explanation, that the Bible Belt's version of Christianity just happens to align perfectly with the political and cultural preferences of white Southerners, and that this alignment is purely coincidental. Consider the odds that a religion founded by a Middle Eastern peasant who preached about loving enemies and serving the poor would naturally produce a political movement focused on cutting taxes, opposing immigration, and defending gun rights. Consider the probability that the same theological tradition that gave us St. Francis of Assisi and Dorothy Day would independently develop a branch that saw capitalism as divinely ordained and environmentalism as satanic deception. The evidence is overwhelming. The Bible Belt wasn't discovered, it was invented. Not by God, not by natural religious development, but by human beings with political goals who needed a theological framework to achieve them. This doesn't mean that the millions of sincere Christians who live in the Bible Belt are somehow fake or their faith is illegitimate. Individual belief is individual belief, and spiritual experience is real regardless of its historical context. But it does mean that the political and cultural claims of Bible Belt Christianity, its insistence that it represents authentic American values, its assumption that conservative politics flow naturally from biblical faith, its conviction that it speaks for God in the public square, are built on foundations that won't bear scrutiny. And increasingly, those foundations are being scrutinized. Young evangelicals are reading the same Bibles their grandparents read, but they're coming away with very different ideas about poverty, racism, and social justice. Christian scholars are producing increasingly sophisticated historical work that documents how political considerations shaped theological development. Even some conservative Christians are beginning to acknowledge that their tradition's political priorities might need some examination. The question is whether Bible Belt Christianity can adapt to these challenges, or whether it will continue to double down on an identity that was always more historical accident than divine plan. The signs aren't encouraging. Instead of engaging with historical evidence about the construction of Southern Christian identity, many evangelical leaders have chosen to retreat further into mythology. Instead of acknowledging the political origins of their theological positions, they've chosen to claim even more direct divine authority. Instead of admitting that faithful Christians can disagree about political priorities, they've chosen to question the faith of Christians who don't share their political conclusions. This strategy might work in the short term. Mythology is often more comforting than history, and identity based on divine election is more appealing than identity based on human construction. But in the long term, it's a losing game. Historical truth has a way of emerging, especially in an age of digital archives and sophisticated scholarship. The contradictions between Bible Belt mythology and historical evidence are becoming harder to ignore. More importantly, the political coalition that sustained Bible Belt Christianity for more than a century is fracturing. The white Southern demographic that provided its core constituency is shrinking as a percentage of both the Southern and national populations. The cultural authority that it once wielded is being challenged by more diverse forms of Christianity that reject its political assumptions. Even within evangelicalism, there are growing divisions between those who want to maintain the political project and those who want to focus on more traditional religious concerns. The Bible Belt that was built in the decades after the Civil War served its purpose. It restored white Southern political power, provided a framework for resisting racial equality, and eventually became the foundation for a national conservative movement. But that purpose is obsolete. The political and cultural circumstances that made the lost cause theology necessary no longer exist. The racial hierarchy that it was designed to defend has been legally dismantled. The regional identity that it was meant to preserve has been transformed by economic modernization and demographic change. What remains is a religious tradition that has forgotten its own history and a political movement that has lost sight of its original goals. The lie that built the Bible Belt is still believed, but it's increasingly a lie without a purpose. And lies without purposes have a tendency to collapse under their own weight. This doesn't mean that conservative Christianity is doomed, or that the South is destined to become secular. Religion is remarkably adaptable, and Southern culture has survived much more dramatic transformations than the ones it faces today. But it does mean that the particular synthesis of theology and politics that defined the Bible Belt for more than a century is reaching the end of its historical moment. What comes next is anybody's guess. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and the rhyme scheme of American religious history suggests that periods of intense politicization are usually followed by periods of spiritual renewal that focus less on cultural combat and more on personal transformation. The question is whether that renewal can happen within existing institutions, or whether it will require new forms of religious community that aren't burdened by the political baggage of the past. Either way, the first step is acknowledgement. Recognition that the Bible Belt was built by human beings for human purposes, and that those purposes may no longer be worth serving. The second step is honesty. Admission that political Christianity has often served political masters more faithfully than it has served Christ. The third step is choice. A decision about whether the future of Southern Christianity lies in defending a manufactured past or creating an authentic future. That choice belongs to the believers themselves, but they can't make it wisely unless they understand the history that brought them to this moment. And that history begins with a simple truth. The Bible Belt was built on a lie created by people who thought they were serving God, but were actually serving themselves. A lie that worked so well that it became indistinguishable from truth. Until now. The Bible Belt as we know it, that seamless fusion of religious devotion and political conservatism, wasn't handed down from heaven or inherited from the founding fathers. It was consciously constructed by human beings responding to specific historical circumstances. Those circumstances have changed. The construction is showing cracks. What happens next depends on whether the people who live in that construction are willing to examine its foundations, or whether they'll choose to shore up the walls and hope for the best. History suggests that hope isn't enough. Truth has a way of emerging, even when it's inconvenient. Especially when it's inconvenient. If you've made it this far, you've just spent 20 minutes discovering how one of America's most powerful religious and political movements was consciously manufactured in response to military defeat and social upheaval. That's not the kind of information they're teaching in most Sunday schools or history classrooms, which is exactly why channels like Professor Archive exist. This kind of deep dive historical research takes time, effort, and resources that frankly aren't easy to come by in today's media landscape. If this video has challenged your assumptions, opened your eyes to hidden history, or just given you something fascinating to think about, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. Every contribution helps us continue digging into the stories that mainstream education leaves out. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because if this video proved anything, it's that the history you think you know probably isn't the whole story. See you in the next deep dive.